At this point, every information portal is saturated with mindfulness content. But this show is a unique, unusual, curious take on mindfulness. Some of what you hear will be completely new to you. Let's dive in and take a look at the nature of the aware mind. I invite you to deepen your awareness so that you may be liberated and inspired. I'm Sarah Vallely, professional coach. I help people overcome anxiety, heal from past trauma, improve their relationships, and maintain better work-life balance. We have Breese Annable back with us today. She was a guest several episodes ago and had such a wonderful conversation. I invited her back. And Breese has a private therapy practice. She works with people who have eating disorders, OCD, and anxiety, and specializes in using DBT approach to therapy. So welcome to the show. Welcome back. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Today, our topic is fear, which is a big topic and it can go in all different directions, but something that touches all of us. All of us experience fear in some way. So when I talk about fears, I'm usually talking about core fears. So for example, fear of being alone, fear of not having control, or fear of not being in control, fear of being seen in a certain way, fear of emotional discomfort. That's actually a really big fear, is just the fear of feeling a certain emotion, such as grief, because that can be very painful. Fear of death. Then we have this response to fear. So we have a fear or fears, and then we have this response. The fear of being alone might cause these worried thoughts of, be alone for this amount of time. I'm going to fall into depression. And the research shows that worry and rumination lead to anxiety and depression. I mean, it's just plain as day in the research. And when I say worry, I'm talking about thoughts about these things that could happen in the future that don't work out. And when I use the word rumination, I'm talking about reflecting on the past in a way that's kind of in a negative sense of really picking apart what happened. Another response that we might have to our fears is avoiding certain situations. So if you have a fear of not being in control, not being able to control circumstances, then a reaction might be to not go on a vacation, because when we go on vacation, there's a lot of things that we need to let go of. Another response that we might have to fear is that it can trigger our nervous system. We might go into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. This idea of being vulnerable with a therapist, being vulnerable with a friend, public speaking, this can cause you to actually go into one of these states where your nervous system is triggered. So that can be a response. Another response to a fear might be it can make you do things that aren't good for you. A fear of emotional discomfort, like feeling one of these emotions that feels uncomfortable. And so we might go to food, we might go to alcohol, we might go to some type of unhealthy sexual encounter or something of that nature. So that can be a response. And also another response might be we just shut down in ways that are unhealthy for us. But these are all responses to the fear and not fear itself. We have the fear and then we have this response. And I like to think that the response is optional. That's something that we can work with a therapist with, we can work with a coach, and we can learn how to go in a different way. And my background is in Buddhism and mindfulness, and the Buddhists teach the first arrow and the second arrow. So the first arrow is that fear, and sometimes the first arrow might be pain, but then we have this reaction to our pain or to our fear. It might be an unhealthy reaction. That is something that we can change and have a more healthy response. So, Breese, I'd love to hear how you would introduce the topic of fear to your audience.
Yeah, absolutely. I love a lot of what you were just saying. Our whole system, when we experience an emotion, are like gears that lock into one another. We have one gear that is our thoughts. We have another gear that's our emotion. And we have another gear that's our body, right? And that is including our physical, our sensations that we might have and that we do have with every emotion. And then also the action that we want to do, because every emotion we have makes us want to act in a very specific way. We're hardwired. Now, of course, there's variability. As you were saying, with fear, some people might shut down, some people might have more of a fight response, right? So there's certainly variation, but we are hardwired to respond in some predictable ways to emotion. The whole system of experience being those gears that lock into one another. When we can identify the emotion, then we can have awareness around the thoughts that we're having, because our mind is going to be programmed to have fear-based thoughts. I think that that's a really helpful starting point, because as you were saying, a lot of what the work that we can do with mindfulness, I think about it as learning the skill and the capability of unhooking those gears if or when it's skillful and useful to do so. And a lot of times it is, especially between the emotion and the action. Right. Because again, every emotion wants that we want to act, or a lot of times react in a certain way that's maybe not always in our best interest. And a lot of times too, our reactivity clouds the heart of the fear, the heart of the emotion. And so it can be a lot of times a lot harder to see it if we're caught in the reactivity, whether it's, actions and thoughts. So mindfulness is such a helpful tool to, I think about it visually as like unhooking those gears, separating those gears if and when we need.
I love that analogy of the gears. So I'm just imagining this in my mind. And so we have the cog, the gear there. And so that's like the emotion gets triggered. And then automatically, then this behavior starts happening. So maybe again, bringing up that example about vulnerability, right? So there's a situation where we know we need to be kind of vulnerable. Maybe we're with our therapist and we're a little scared to share something. And then this behavior happens where we switch the subject, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's our thing. When that vulnerability comes up, switch subject.
Yeah.
And the mindfulness part, I'm so glad you brought that up, is seeing that happening. Like maybe we're not going to change it right away, but the first thing is like, oh, I'm doing it.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'd love to get to, the ways that we can separate those gears. But I had another thought about this book that I read called It Didn't Start With You by Mark Woolen. It's about generational trauma. And so I was just thinking about, where do these fears come from? In that book at the end, what they lead you to do is get to your core fear, and they have you answer a list of questions that get you to that core fear. And I did it separately, and both my teenage kids did it separately. And we all came up with the same core fear, which had to do with being trapped and enslaved. When it brought us through that process, it all had something to do with that. And my grandfather was a prisoner of war in World War II for 2 years. According to the book, that's, one of the ways that it's passed down, whether you think it's biological or it's just through, culture in the family.
Absolutely. And I think, exercises and readings like that are so helpful, because one of the things I know that you and I were chatting a little bit about prior to meeting today was this idea that not every emotion is valid per se. I like to think about, it's kind of, Rumi's poem, The Guest House, talks about emotions being like guests that come to our home. And that I love that idea. I think about that all the time. Like every emotion is a messenger. But it gets tricky when we talk about emotions that are conditioned from the past, because a lot of times I say those emotions can have the wrong house. Or meaning like when we all have conditioned emotional reactions, like every human being has that. And certainly when you talk about trauma, that very much is the case, right? Because the brain a lot of times goes on high alert, And it says, I am going to do everything I can to protect us and to keep us from that happening again. The problem is what's happening in the brain in that way is in a very primal part of the brain. I say is like stuck in a time warp. It doesn't necessarily pay attention to, are we still in danger? But it keeps us reacting in a way that we never get a chance to actually experience the potential for safety or the potential that those conditions are no longer present. I think that is one of the most powerful parts of mindfulness, is that it allows us to be in this place where we can pause and step back from that emotional reaction, that conditioned reaction, and pause in that moment so we can really discern, is there danger? Because that's what fear is signaling, right? There is some danger to our life, our health, our well-being, physical, mental, emotional, or something that we love. Mindfulness gives us that opportunity to pause in our reaction and discern, is this danger real and present now? Because if it's not, there is this potential for more flexibility, more creativity, responding to the present moment that's more reflective of our reality now, not just our conditioned reactions from past experiences that we might have. So every emotion we have, we should have 2 speed bumps before we react, ideally. And the first one, is it valid? And what I mean by that is like, do I have the facts in the present moment to justify this emotion? Because again, so often, and absolutely with fear especially, so often we can be conditioned based on past experiences that aren't necessarily reflective of our present reality. Is it valid? Do I have the facts in this moment? And then the second is it effective to act on this fear? That speed bump very often comes in, for example, you were talking about vulnerability. Well, with vulnerability, we might ask that question, is it valid? And we might go, yeah, absolutely. It's risky to be vulnerable with somebody. There's always that risk. And yet we might hit that second speed bump and say, but is it effective for me to shut down or change the subject, or, to not proceed into vulnerability? And we may decide, well, no, it's actually in my best interest or in the best interest of this relationship for me to go towards the fear. Is it valid? And then is it effective for me to act on? Because again, so often fear comes up and it might be valid, but that's the amazing thing about being human, is that we can strengthen that ability and have that capability moving towards something, even when it might be scary, because it's in our best interest.
I find what you're speaking about, having this reaction not be very timely, come up with people who are operating in trauma survival mode, right? So they needed to react in certain ways as a child to create safety for themselves. But now they're 40 years old, they're living on their own, they have a good job, they have all this set in their lives, but they're still acting as if they're in danger. So I think those questions about, is this valid? Am I really in this situation where I'm not safe? Because for some reason your body and brain are on the wrong page, right? They're kind of thinking that you aren't. So yeah, really important. The one thing I would love for listeners to take away from this episode is this speaking to yourself, having these conversations with yourself, narrating like you're talking about, you're asking yourself the questions. And so here's one way that someone could take pause and start looking at asking questions and narrating your experience. Sometimes you just need to talk yourself through it, but a lot of people don't know what to say. How do I do that? So this example is someone who's already gotten in touch with, what that fear is. And so they're stating the fear. I'm afraid of not being able to be in control of the situation, afraid of not knowing how it's going to play out, not being able to influence that. And I'm responding with worried thoughts. I'm worrying about how things are going to go wrong, which is not the most ideal response. So really just noticing what you're doing, narrating it, acknowledging that, this doesn't need to play out this way, but this is what I'm doing. And then you could even go further and say, instead, I'm going to sit with my fear and say it again. I am afraid. This is what I'm afraid of. I'm afraid of not being able to control the outcome. And you might go even further and ask yourself, how does this feel in my body? I have a child who's trans, and that has brought up so much fear for, how he's going to be received by our culture, by our society. And really right now, the only thing that's getting me through it is I just sit with it and I just say, I'm afraid for what could happen here. And I know it's so counterintuitive, but it's the only thing that calms me down. I'm just like owning it. I'm like, this is what's happening. And something happens within me and I calm down. So that narration can be very powerful.
Absolutely. We don't talk to ourselves enough. It's because so often people think that it's weird or odd, or, they might say that like in a whisper, like, I talk to myself a lot. And I'm like, great. Because exactly what you're saying, it's that part of mindfulness, the observe and describe, or the noticing and the naming or labeling. There's so many different words that we can use in the mindfulness practice. The labeling is just so important. It facilitates that witness state. It also just neurologically is keeping the frontal lobe online, which is where mindfulness lives. And, and can be a really helpful regulation to our brain not being fully hijacked by our emotions. So it's just a helpful practice in saying like, here's what it is. And then just being able to, I don't want to say just, because it's one of those things, sounds very simple as we talk about it, and it is anything but when, for example, it's the safety of your child. I also wanted to touch on another thing that you were just saying as well, that I think one of the really great things that the practice that you were just talking about can allow us to do, there's some different options that we might have. One is, of course, being present and staying present. And that's in and of itself a miracle that we're able to do that, especially with these really tough emotions. Another thing that we can do, especially if we have gotten to the place where we can name those fears, is it gives us an opportunity to really be a scientist in our lives. And maybe if there's a particular situation that we're facing and we have this fear and we have this expectation. And so asking ourselves, what am I expecting from this situation, or from, whether it's from myself, from my experience, from the circumstance or situation itself. And it gives us an opportunity to test it out. All right, fear, let's see what you got. How good of a fortune teller you are. In therapy, in the psychology world, we talk about that as exposure, where we name our expectation and then we mindfully test it out like a scientist. A lot of my clients, we kind of joke, I'm like, how's that fortune teller? So we can also start to like have a bit of more like looseness around our thoughts of going, oh yeah, there's that fortune teller, hasn't made the best predictions in the past. So it really helps again to have that sense of agency where we can experience our fears and we're not necessarily beholden to act on them or react to them. Especially when we're talking about core fears. I say to people like your greatest hits, fears that keep coming up. That can be just such a powerful experience to really test those fears out.
I can see that being really helpful, just kind of looking at the history of how that plays out. I sometimes say to my clients, think about your friends, your family, and think about what their biggest fears are, because the people that we're close to, we usually know what their biggest fears are. And I ask them, how often have those actually come true? Like, oh, never, right? Sitting with the fear, just to be present with it And I think that's so important. And the one way to think about it is, well, what's the alternative? The alternative to that is probably not going to be very good. It's probably going to be going towards our addictions, or, just kind of numbing out. And is this fear going to play out? Thinking about that, I see that working. And then there's another option, validating your experience, validating your fear. I was at Walgreens in my car in line to get a COVID test, and it was taking longer than I expected. And I was looking like I was going to be late to meet with my next client. And so I was in this like total fear, like complete anxiety about not getting home in time. And I don't always catch myself, but I usually try to catch myself. I'm like, oh, well, why don't I use one of the tools that I talk about all day? It's like, I could do that instead of sit here and have a freak out. I sat there in my car while the person was taking forever getting my COVID test. And I said to myself, it's understandable that I'm afraid of missing this appointment with my client, because it means a lot to me. I don't want to let this person down. And, when I started talking to myself, having that conversation with myself, I calmed down, and it shifted into this more of a little sadness, more of a like a little, like, this is a bummer. Like, it's going to be a bummer if I miss this, but it was better, right? You can be it's just like complete fear and anxiety, or just like, that's a bummer. That's going to be a bummer. So that validating your fear can be really helpful, and just, it's understandable. I'm afraid of blank, whatever it is, because whatever the reason is, it's understandable that I have a fear of not being in control because I've had trauma. Like in my past, I've had trauma. This is understandable. It's understandable that I'm afraid of people perceiving me in a certain way because I'm sensitive. I'm a sensitive person, and I do care. I do care how people see me. So that's also something that can be really helpful. So that's what's neat about this, is there's all these different options, and trying them out. And again, being a scientist, trying out different strategies and seeing what works.
I mean, validation, I think, can never go wrong, right? The key to validation, I think, so often is being able to find the kernel of truth in the experience. And this is what you're talking about with finding like the core fear, and that can be really tricky, because sometimes we might find ourselves reacting in a way that is maybe not particularly skillful, right? If we go to an addictive behavior, or we shut down, we don't want to validate that. We don't want to say, oh, of course I'm doing X, Y. I mean, we can be understanding and compassionate, but very often it's being able to like follow the string back to like, what is the kernel of truth in this experience? Find that kernel of truth, and it's always there. And very often it is our emotional experience. I talk about validation as that, of course, I feel X, Y, or Z. Research shows us that validation is a really powerful tool for emotion regulation. Whether or not somebody else validates us or we validate ourselves, the same effect happens. And so that's, again, the power of talking to ourselves. It's like, Pema Chodron talks about be your own best friend, unconditional friendliness. It's leveraging self-talk to really activate parts of our brain and our nervous system that have profound regulatory effects. And validation so often is like number one as far as what really helps our nervous system to regulate.
It's like, yeah, we have the fear and we have all this going on. It's hard. And then on top of it, we're like, resist, not accept. And all of that does is just intensify everything. So if we can accept some of the things going on, it's just going to bring things down. And I wondered if you do much work around this coexisting of the fear and the action. Like I am afraid of being vulnerable, using that example again. I'm afraid of being vulnerable, yet I'm going to be vulnerable at the same time. This acceptance of, yes, I can, they can exist at the same time. Because I think that in some of our psyches, we're like, they can't happen at the same time, but they really can. And I find the more that we do that, the more that we sit with and accept both happening at the same time, then it easier and easier it is. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Absolutely. I talk with people about that a lot. And if we want to look at, the direction of the field of psychology as well, especially in treatment of OCD, for example, there's this shift that has happened over, probably the last 10 years or so, where it is shifting more towards acceptance of the presence of, a lot of times it's anxiety with OCD. There may be other experiences as well. But, when I first learned exposure and those kinds of treatments, the idea was like, move on when the anxiety or the distress drops. Now our thinking is more, do you feel capable of being with it? Is this something that you feel is tolerable and you're willing to accept? And a lot of times for people, the fear or the distress does go down with experience. And yet there's been a shift away from emphasizing that, because it's the idea of like, we don't want to send the message of, you can't tolerate this, or fear is something to be afraid of or to avoid. Because again, there is so much value in having the capability of saying, yes, and I can be afraid, and I get anxious public speaking. I have learned to accept that experience. I've gotten really familiar with it too. For example, I'm like, oh, this is the part where my heart starts to get, starts to race, and I'll get kind of short of breath, and I'll have the worry thought, oh my gosh, what if people are noticing? I'm so familiar with it. And I'm like, all right, here we go. Right? This is the part where this happens. It tends to now dissipate more quickly, because I'm not adding to it. I'm not going, oh my gosh, what's happening now? Oh my gosh, is anybody noticing? I'm not adding to it. Again, I've gotten to know it. It's not scary to me anymore. It's not aversive to me anymore. It's simply an experience that happens. And that's the power of mindfulness too, is we get to know it, intimately get to know that response. So it doesn't have to be a scary thing, and we can be present with it. And circling back to what I was talking about at the beginning with separating the gears at times when we need to, it's that yes, and I can be afraid, and I can do this thing because it's important to me.
I love this idea of getting familiar with it and being like, oh, yes, that's what comes next. I mean, that's what's happened with me, with my kids. I mean, I have 2 teenagers, and it's just, I've gotten to the point where like, oh, okay, this is the time where I start to freak out. This is the time where I start to go into like complete mom worry mode. Okay, this is the part where I catch that. And I'm like, well, let's think about what's happening here. And let's return more to the essence of what's happening. Oh, this is when my body like feels like it's going to explode. But it does help, because you just kind of start to move through the process a little bit more quickly. I mean, it used to take me maybe 3 weeks to like work through something. Yes. Now I'm down to like 3 days. So it's really great. Breese, I'm so thankful that you were here as a guest today. I know that your practice is here in Asheville, but you're also licensed in many other states. If you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about your practice and how people can get a hold of you.
The best way is through my website, Living Balance AVL, like Asheville, livingbalanceavl.com. But yeah, my website's the best way to check out the work that I do and where I'm able to practice, which, as you mentioned, is across many states in the country. So it's just so nice to be able to connect to people really all over the country. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more, please feel free to check out my website.
Thank you so much, Breese.
Thank you.
The Aware Mind podcast is a TSD mindfulness production. Please check out our show notes for upcoming events and links to additional resources. Please visit our website at tsdmind.org. That is T as in tame, S as in soothe, D as in dwell, mind as in mindfulness.org. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram at TSD_mindfulness.